Hi, thank you all for coming. This is just terrific. This is one of my first talks with a group of friends. And that's a little weird for me. My husband is here and some of our very dear friends are here. And all the rest of you, I hope, will be my friends by the end of the talk. I'd like to thank Sheila Weber, who invited me, and Ann Freifeld, who's been absolutely wonderful, and my husband, who supports everything that I do, which is really quite terrific. As you know, I am Joan Adler, the Executive Director of the Straus Historical Society. I have been the historian for this family for 23 years. Happened as a fluke. I'm neither trained in history, nor in genealogy, nor in public speaking, but somehow, here I am. And it's kind of fun. It's the family of Isidore and Ida Straus. Most people know that story. Isidore and Ida went down on Titanic together. It's also the family that owned Macy's for 100 years. It is not the family of Levi Strauss, the man who invented jeans. That's another family. And it is also not the family of Straus Dairies. I'm not sure if people on the East Coast know about Straus Dairies, but it's a dairy just north of San Francisco, and that family came from Berlin, and it's an entirely different family. Yes, it's also A&S, and a company that today is called Straus du Parquet, that supplies china and dishes for the hotel trade and restaurants. Started out as L. Straus & Sons, and I'll tell you about that in a little while. So Sheila asked me to give you an overview about the history of the family. It's an amazing family. And I'm going to try and pick out the most important and interesting facts because there is just so much to tell. There are more than 15,000 individuals in my database. And I've got stories that could keep you here for months. But I promise I won't. Hopefully you'll all be awake at the end of the talk. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce just one person, my assistant, Catherine Smith, who's all the way at the back. And she is the person who makes me look good. All right. She has created our website, which I hope you will visit, our Facebook page. As of yesterday, we have a video on YouTube. We're feeling very, very professional and grown up. What is it, Google Plus? A Google Plus account, and we're just in the 21st century, thanks to Catherine. And you can email me, you can email Catherine. We are happy to talk to you. We are happy to respond to any questions. And since this is a local crowd, we even are happy to come back here if you request it. Okay, the Strausses originated in the southwestern part of Germany. You can see I put an arrow to a little town called Ottoberg. They actually started in a town called Dirmstein, which is right near there, and then moved to Niederkirchen, and by 1808 settled in Ottoberg. And this was a piece of the world that was sometimes in France and sometimes in Germany, depending on the political situation. And so the Strausses spoke French and German and Hebrew. They were prosperous people, they were educated and cultured. They were landowners who sent their crops, wheat, barley, oats, clover seed, and those of their neighbors. There was a very big revolution in Europe in 1848. And as a result, many people felt a financial pinch after that. Lazarus Straus was the oldest of 14. His father had died in 1838, and so he became the head of the family. He was educated, and he was a good businessman. But it was still very, very tough, especially for some of his younger siblings. They sold some of their acreage to raise money, and then because of the financial problems, the people who bought these plots of land at auction reneged on it, and so that they were in danger of a bankruptcy. Also, although he did not participate in the Revolution of 1848, he helped to raise funds, and he learned that he was going to be called before the courts to explain his action. And so to avoid both the impending bankruptcy and having to go before the courts, he decided maybe it was time to emigrate. As some of you know, there was a very large German Jewish population in Philadelphia at the time. And so he traveled to Le Havre in the summer of 1852 and went to Philadelphia, where he was advised that there would be opportunities for him in the South. There's a really large picture of Georgia. He went to, see where, if you can see where it says Columbus. And then a little bit to the east of that, a little north and east, it says Talbotton. That's the area where he went. He met up with two brothers, the Kaufman brothers, who came from Lichtenau, which is another small town very close to where his family came. We're not 100% sure if families knew each other in Germany or if they just met up together there. But he was advised to go to this area, and they would set him up with a peddler's cart. Now, most of us think of a pushcart peddler as somebody from the Lower East Side, and maybe that wasn't such a great thing to be. But in the South, it was a really different profession because there weren't many centers of population. There weren't stores. It was before the advent of what was called the Jew store, which is mostly a dry goods store. And so Lazarus had this cart, and he would drive with a horse in the cart with goods that he obtained from Philadelphia and from New York, from plantation to plantation. These houses had an outside porch with one room with a door, so that if he arrived at night, he could let himself in, sleep in that house overnight, in the morning have breakfast with the family, deliver the goods they had ordered, bring little trinkets and treats for the girls, spread the news from one plantation to the next, water, feed his horse, and then move on to the next plantation. After doing that for a while, and he had come without his family, he was in the town of Talbotton, which is the county seat of Talbot County, on court day. Because this is a very rural area, they had court day once a month. And so they would hear cases just once a month. He thought this was a very civilized town. He was very excited because people came from all over to Talbotton on that specific day. Farmers would butcher their cows and pigs and bring them and sell the meat. Produce was sold. It was like a fair. And he said, this is the first civilized place that I've seen. I think I could bring my family and live in this town. He found a man named Captain Curley who had a barbershop and was not utilizing all the space. And so he rented half of that store and opened a dry goods store. And in September of 1852, he sent for his wife and his 4 children. This ship is the SS St. Louis, and it's interesting that this is the maiden voyage. It's a mail ship, and it's the maiden voyage. So Isidore came on the maiden voyage. This ship came to New York. Lazarus came from the South. The children describe in their autobiographies, and we have several of those, waiting excitedly, seeing their dad on the pier, waving to them, very, very excited. And finally, they were able to disembark. Here we have Lazarus and Sarah. That picture was taken in Talbotton in the 1860s. You'll notice how she's holding her arm in her lap. She had a stroke 3 years before she came to America. So it's really quite remarkable that she was able to travel with 4 very, very young children. She came in 1854. Her youngest child was 4. The oldest was born in 1845, and so she had 4 children between the age of 9 and 4. And she traveled from Heidelberg to Le Havre, took a ship to New York, then they went to Philadelphia, and they stayed there a little while because there was yellow fever in the South, very common in that time. Finally, they took a ship to Savannah, then a train to a little town called Geneva, and then it was called a rockaway, it's a great big carriage, to their home. Quite a trip for someone who was partially paralyzed. And this is the first home that they lived in Talbot, and we feel really, really lucky to have this picture. That house is no longer there. Today there's a library that stands in that spot, but there is a marker that says this is the site of the first home. The youngest of the children, Oscar Straus, wrote an autobiography. I'll tell you about him later, but in it he wrote, "We found a very comfortable home ready for us. My precocious brother Isidore immediately inspected the whole and thought it odd to be in a house built on stilts, as he called it. The house, typical of that locality, has no cellar, but was supported by an open foundation of wooden pillars about 25 feet apart." Can you imagine living in a house that looks like that? And they were thrilled, and this is a prosperous family. So this is quite an adventure for these people. And here we have the Straus sons. On the left we have Isidore. Next to him is Oscar, that's the youngest child. And then we have Nathan Straus. I'll tell you about all of these boys. These pictures were taken about 1860 in Georgia, in Talbot, Georgia. I'm going to tell you a few stories. Nathan Straus, the boy holding the dog, was somebody who was always a wheeler dealer. He was full of ideas and full of energy. In the South, as you know, they had slaves. And although the family didn't really believe in slavery because of the mother's handicap, they always had at least one slave to help her in the house. And Nathan, as a very young boy, was an entrepreneur. He went to the slave market and bought a very, very pregnant slave, thinking he was getting two for the price of one. What he didn't realize was that she was so pregnant she really couldn't do much work. And then once the baby was born, they had to feed 2 mouths instead of 1. So the family loves to tell this story. In fact, Lazarus would buy a slave, teach him to read or write, get him set up, and then free him. And so slaves in this town were begging to be bought by the Strauses. When they moved to New York after the Civil War, they brought the 2 youngest slaves with them because they weren't ready to be freed and left in the South. When Isidore was 16, he was the oldest son, he decided that he wanted a military career. And one of the neighborhood boys had an appointment to West Point, and Isidore thought that would be just a great career for him. But then the Civil War broke out, and that was the end of that dream. He wrote that by 1861, almost the entire South had become one big military camp, and he wanted to become part of it. So the boys in his little village put together a troop of young boys who were going to help the Confederates during the war. But the Governor Brown, said, we don't even have enough arms and uniforms for the men. We certainly can't help the you boys fight in this war. And so they disbanded at that time. So Isidore went to Marietta and tried to join the Georgia Military Academy. And he found an acquaintance of his who invited him back to his rooms. And so he went back to the rooms where this boy was living, and he didn't notice that the door was slightly ajar. But when he opened the room, a bucket full of water fell on him. It was hazing. He was so disgruntled, he said, if that's what being in the military is like, I don't want any part of this. So he went back to his hotel, changed into dry clothing, rented a cart, drove to a local mill, bought some of the mill's product, made a contract, sold it, and started his merchandising career right then and there. And he said, had this water not fallen on my head, who knows what I might have done in my life. But that was what he credits the beginning of his career, because a bucket of water fell on his head. He was, yes, not so young, he wasn't all washed up. The Strauses were active in their community and very well respected. But in September of 1862, the war was going on, and a presentment was issued by the Talbot County grand jury. And in it, they accused the Jews of usury. You know Jews are always a scapegoat. And the times were really hard. They couldn't get supplies from anywhere. Everybody was starving. Everybody was in bad shape. And Lazarus, who thought that he was well honored in this community, decided that he was very hurt by this. And even though he was assured by the leaders of his community that they didn't mean him, it was everybody else. There weren't a whole lot of Jews there at that time, so I don't know who that everybody else was. He decided that he could no longer live there. And so he packed his family up, and he moved 38 miles west to the city of Columbus. It took 1 whole day to get there, 38 miles. They put everything they owned into 1 cart. Can you imagine moving anywhere in 1 cart? It's quite extraordinary to think that that could happen. Earlier, in April 19, 1861, President Abraham Lincoln issued a blockade proclamation. Ships interfering with the commerce of the Union would be treated under the laws of piracy. England quickly recognized the state of war between the 2 factions and declared their own neutrality. This act was seen by the Union as sympathetic to the South. And from the beginning of the war, leaders in the Confederacy realized that they'd have to obtain great quantities of military supplies from abroad. Remember, the South was agrarian. They had very little industrial base back then, and still today. Mostly rural and agrarian South had not developed an industrial base and found itself without military armaments necessary to conduct a protracted war with the Union. The South didn't have a merchant fleet large enough to bring the supplies from Great Britain, Nassau, Bermuda, or Havana. In order to remedy this, companies were formed, like the Georgia Importing and Exporting Company. And on the left, you see a newspaper article announcing the formation. It reads, "For the purpose of opening and carrying on direct trade with foreign countries." Lazarus Straus was one of its subscribers. Each subscriber pledged a specific amount of cotton to the company. And then with the proceeds, the company expected to start building blockade runners and to bring back armaments and material that was needed by the South. And so this sounded like a great idea. On September 19th, seems like it just went down. Oh, here, we're back again. On September 19th, 1863, Isidore wrote to his uncle Emmanuel, who was in San Francisco. Emmanuel was his father's brother and a great confidant. And I'm going to read this because I think it's pretty important. "The war in which the South has been engaged within the last 3 years has called upon the requisition from time to time all the resources within her command. Men were called out from 18 to 35, and I approached the age faster than circumstances looked favorable. A company was made up in our city for the purpose of purchasing ships wherein to run cotton out and merchandise into our country. An agent was appointed to go to Europe and try to negotiate a loan with the cotton as side security. This agent appointed me as his assistant with the understanding that I would have paid my own expenses. And if he succeeded in negotiating, then I would have purchased the merchandise wherein the ships were to be loaded. Father was very anxious for me to accept this position, as it was one of the few chances which men offered wherein I could so honorably bid farewell to our once happy but now almost miserable country." Unquote. Isidore was taken on by the Georgia Importing and Exporting Company as the secretary of Lloyd G. Bowers. He traveled to Charleston, where on his first letter home on June 18th, he wrote, "Arrived here safe and dirty. We met here with Charlie Lamar, the celebrated African trader, who was going with us. He is a very fine man. Mr. Bowers is a perfect gentleman." Now, he said African trader. What he really meant was the famous African slaver. Charlie Lamar was very famous throughout the South. He was from New Orleans, and he was bringing slaves from Africa. Isidore found passage on a ship called the Alice. This is not the Alice, but it's very much like it. We have been unable to find either an illustration or a photograph of the Alice, but this is one that looks very much like his ship. He wore an undershirt-like garment, into which his mother had sewn $1,200 in gold. He was required to lie quietly below the waterline while the Alice left Charleston Harbor, and theirs was the only ship to get out that night. He described his appearance after being allowed on deck as that of a man who had been in the Russian baths. You can imagine how hot and awful it was in Charleston in the summer. He arrived in New Providence in Nassau, Sunday, June 21st, 1863, and after a stopover in New York, arrived in London on July 24th. When Isidore was still in Charleston, he had a letter of introduction to a man named Nathan Blunn, who was living in New York. Nathan Blunn was the father of Amanda Blunn Rothschild. Not the Rothschilds of banking fame, another Rothschild family. But Amanda was the sister of a girl named Ida. So when Isidore did get to New York, even though it was really dangerous for a Southerner to be in the North, he surely met Ida at the time, but she was about 13 years old, and he probably wasn't really all that interested. He was 18. As it turns out, he did stop in New York, and he met Ida, and we know that's important, because in 1871, they got married. She was a lovely 22-year-old who captured not only his interest, but his heart. They were engaged in April and married in July. At that time, people didn't have long engagements. Isidore spent all of the rest of the war years in Europe trading in Confederate bonds. I remember he was 18 years old. Could you imagine your children or grandchildren going off to Europe alone with $1,200 in gold and doing business? I mean, it's extraordinary to think about it. His hometown of Columbus was occupied April 16, 1865, actually after the war was over. But General Wilson hadn't gotten the word, and he burned the town. Lazarus was left with almost nothing, and he had enough. He decided to start over at 57 years old in the north. The family traveled first to Philadelphia, a trip of 8 days, and then to New York on Isidore's suggestion. Letters from Lazarus to his family in Germany describe the robberies, fires, and killings. He wrote in September 1865 that he'd been out of business since April and that he would feel calmer once he was in business again. And Isidore had hoped by then that they would go into the import business together. Lazarus used the time before he could figure out what to do by visiting the suppliers that he'd had from the north when he was still in the south. And he paid off all of his debts. He sold what remaining cotton he had, and he paid back every single penny. He stated that even if he left his children nothing else, he wanted to leave them a good name. Imagine the integrity. This was the first penny that most of these suppliers had received from anybody in the South, and they were quite impressed with that. A man named Mr. Caldwell said that he would sell Lazarus his business. He said, "Don't expect to be rich, but you can make a good living." Well, we know what happened. A lease was signed, May 1866, and L. Straus and Son was formed. It was Lazarus and Isidore as partners. They were importers of china, crockery, glassware, and manufacturers of lamps. Nathan, the next oldest son, joined the business after completing high school in New York, and then it became L. Straus and Sons. They had one daughter, Hermina, and her husband also joined. His name was also Lazarus Combs, and he also joined the firm. Now this firm was very famous for their cut glass, and there's something very interesting about cut glass. One cannot put your name anywhere, etch your name, because of all the little angles. And so all of these pieces had little paper labels. But these things were not put on a shelf the way we put things today. They were actually used all the time. And so when they washed, the paper labels fell off. And so all of these pieces have patterns that are patented. And that's how each firm protected. They were all hand cut, and that's how they protected the patterns that they created. And so we know that this is the Hermione pattern. And there is a patent for it, along with lots of other patents. Isidore, as we know, spent the war years learning how to do business. He returned to his family with $12,000 in gold, with which he bought his mom a house and invested the rest in this new business. We know they prospered. Isidore describes in his autobiography the frugality that made it possible. Nathan had become friendly with a man named Roland Hussey Macy. There really was a guy named Macy. R.H. Macy. He owned a dry goods store in New York City on 14th Street. He had been a sea captain in Nantucket and in New England. And finally, in 1854, coincidentally, came to New York, opened up this little dry goods store. The center of commerce at the time was 14th Street and 6th Avenue. And he had this little teeny store. And Nathan convinced him to allow the Strauses to open up a 25 by 100 foot concession to sell their product in the basement. And it was on this distinction that Macy's became the first department store. Up until then, it was dry goods or home furnishings in different stores. But once the Strauses came in, the store, they very quickly accounted for 60% of the profits in this store. And they started expanding. And what they did was they'd buy up the building next to them. And then they'd buy the building behind them. And then they'd buy another one. So to shop in that, we'd have this warren of angles and things. It was a mess. In 1877, Nathan and Macy were in Paris together on a buying trip, and Macy died. He had a son and a daughter, and in those days the daughter did not inherit businesses. And the son was an alcoholic. So he was not the right person for this job also. So there was a partner, and then there was another partner, and then there was another partner, and either they didn't do well or they died. So in 1888, the Strauses were part owners, and by 1894, they owned the entire business.
Why did they keep the name?
Because it was familiar by then. It had expanded to such an extent, based really on the Strauses' success, but the name was familiar. So rather than change it all of a sudden, they did buy Abraham and Wexler and changed that name to Abraham and Straus. That store was in Brooklyn, and it was opened because of the Brooklyn Bridge. A man named General Abraham, had a partner named Wexler, and he thought, well, commerce is in New York, but now that there's a bridge, commerce will start to go to Brooklyn. And so he opened a store there, and the Strauses became friendly with them and bought out Wexler. And so they also owned Abraham and Straus. That name they did change. Sarah died in 1876, and Lazarus lived until 1898. He was born in 1809, so he was quite old for the time. And he lived with his daughter, Hermina. Every Sunday, everybody in the family went to her house for brunch. Very, very close family. And although there was a gradual change in leadership, Lazarus stayed involved and interested in the business throughout his life. And the children took care of him. It was a very, very close family. Isidore stayed in the store and attended to his business, while Nathan, who had too much energy to stay in an office, traveled around the country, opening up markets and going to Europe buying. As their sons completed college, mostly at Harvard, they also started working in the family business. Before 1902, it became clear that the 14th Street store was no longer large enough, and there was no longer any room to expand. And so very, very quietly, the Strauses started buying up land on 34th Street. They were leaders in the community. Isidore was part of the Chamber of Commerce. In fact, he had been in the House of Representatives. I'll tell you that later. They knew that a subway line was being extended to 34th Street. And they knew that a bus route was going to be coming in cross town. So they knew that this was a really good place. And so very quietly, they went around and they started buying up property. However, if you can see the notch in the building, the man who owned that, who was a tobacconist, found out that they were buying up property. And he thought, well, I'll just hold out and get more money and I'll become rich. And the Strauses will need that piece of land because they have everything else. And the Strauses said, we will not be held for ransom, and they built around it. And so to this day, if you go to 34th Street, you will see a notch in the building. Today, at least the last time I was there was a sunglass hut there. But the notch is still there. And on the bottom, November 8th, 1902, that's a picture of the executive offices. The two people standing are the sons of Isidore, Jesse and Percy, and sitting in the chair is the youngest brother of Isidore and Nathan, Oscar, who never really was in the family business. The store, what they did was, they never really closed the old store until all of the merchandise was brought to 34th Street. And so they had a continuous stream of carts at night, bringing all of the, and in those days it was horse-drawn carts, bringing all of the merchandise. So when everything was there and they had their opening day, they closed the other store. As I told you, L. Straus and Son, among other things, cut glass. And so we have here a picture of the 8th floor, the cutting room floor. Once they owned Macy's, they brought in their cutters to cut the glass. And people would be able to stand around and watch it. If you notice where the glass is being cut, there's a cone coming down. When you cut glass, the sparks that come out. And so they had these cones with water dripping on the wheels to prevent that. But all the floors were made of wood, and there was a great danger of fire. And so it didn't last too long. They decided that maybe this was not one of their better ideas. And so they closed the 8th floor cutting floor. This is the youngest son, Oscar. He didn't want to go into the family business. His father and his brothers supported his desire to complete his education, including college and law school at Columbia in New York City. As early as 1865, Lazarus wrote to his family in Germany, stating, "Nathan is very valuable to me in business, only he doesn't have much patience to learn much. But I want Oscar to go through all the schools, since he does enjoy learning." And since we're talking about education, I'm going to backtrack just a second and remind you that Isidore never completed high school. The war isn't it amazing? I mean, the war broke out and he was done. And once he'd been in Europe, his father said, well, when you come back to New York, you can continue your education. And he said, no, I've earned money, I'm in business, I love it, I'm done with school. Nathan, who finished his education in New York City, only graduated high school. And it was only Oscar, the youngest son, who went to college and became a lawyer. The daughter, Hermina, went to a school called Levert College for Girls, which was sort of like a prep school in Talbotton. She married in Talbotton and had a child there, so her education was also stopped because of the war and just because of the lack of opportunities for women. But I think it's just amazing when you realize what this family accomplished, considering their lack of education. After graduating Columbia Law, Oscar worked in a law office and then opened his own firm. But he was a very small man with lots of energy, and it soon became apparent that he was just going to wear himself out if he continued. And so with the support of his family, he left law completely. He started writing articles, and he started writing books, and he started doing good deeds. He wrote at one point that if public service was a profession, that's what he'd like to do. And I think he really invented that profession. He said, "My whole outlook is idealistic rather than practical." He was a founder in 1874 of the YMHA. Pretty good. That's why we're here. He was also a founder of the American Jewish Historical Society in 1894 and was its first president. He drew the attention of politicians from both sides of the political aisle and was nominated to represent the United States as minister to Constantinople in 1887. Henry Ward Beecher, then one of the most famous clergymen in New York, wrote a letter of recommendation for Oscar to President Grover Cleveland. And I have to quote this because I think it's pretty important. "Of his fitness, there is a general consent that he is personally and in attainments eminently excellent. But I am interested in another quality, the fact that he is a Hebrew. The bitter prejudice against Jews, which obtains in many parts of Europe, ought not to receive any countenance in America. It is because he's a Jew that I would urge his appointment as a fit recognition of this remarkable people, who were becoming large contributors to American prosperity, and whose intelligence, morality, and large liberality in all public measures for the welfare of society deserve and should receive from the hands of our government some such recognition." Right? That's pretty amazing. With his family's support, Oscar accepted the position and served until 1889 when Cleveland was defeated. He served again from 1898 to 1899 under William McKinley, and again in 1909 to 1910 under William Henry Taft, this time as ambassador to Turkey. Some of you may know that Morgenthau followed him. The Morgenthau family followed them quite a lot. He also served as Secretary of Commerce and Labor under President Teddy Roosevelt. And he was the first Jewish member of a cabinet. At that time, Commerce and Labor was one position. I have to tell you just a little aside, I have a relative who came in 1906, and the Immigration Bureau was under Commerce and Labor, and my relative was deported, not allowed to enter, and the papers are signed by Oscar Straus. Who knew when I started this job that I would confront something like that? He was also a permanent member of the International Court of Arbitration at The Hague and instrumental in the formation of the League of Nations. We have a list that is 5 single-spaced pages of his associations, honors, activities. It's just incredible. This man was just unbelievable. He wrote under 4 administrations from Cleveland to Taft in 1922, his autobiography, and it's a wonderful resource for it. And he also wrote several other books, including one called Roger Williams Straus. Roger Williams, he was very enamored of the idea of religious liberty, and so he named his son Roger Williams Straus, and we still have Roger Williams Straus as we're up to Roger Williams Straus III in the family. After his death, in 1926, it was proposed that a memorial be placed in Washington near the Commerce Building. But first there was a Great Depression, and then there was a war. And so it wasn't until 1947 that a group of statues was finally dedicated in what was to become the Federal Triangle. But then the building was torn down. This is all very complicated. But there is a law in Washington that says that once a group of statues is dedicated, it cannot be put in storage. And so for many, many years, it was in a parking lot. It was just right out there in a parking lot. In 1998, the new Ronald Reagan Federal Building and International Trade Center was dedicated, and the statues were placed there, and we were lucky enough to have a very special rededication ceremony that the government made for us for these statues. The circle in the center is a pool with water spraying up all over, and around the edge of it, it says Oscar Straus, statesman, author, public servant, blah, blah, blah. And the 2 dark sides, on either edge, are those two statues. It's quite lovely, and apparently people who work in the building in the nice weather enjoy sitting out there and having their lunch along the edge. I've already told you that Nathan had far too much energy to be contained in a classroom or in an office. He was a man with a multitude of ideas, many of them involving how he could help his fellow man. When his family was leaving the South at the end of the Civil War, they took a train to Philadelphia, and somehow he got left in one of the stations along the way. He was a young boy. He was born in 1848, and this was 1865. So he was a young teenager. He had no money, and in those days there were no cell phones. He couldn't call his mom and say help. So after spending a whole day in the depot, somebody felt sorry for him and bought him an ice cream and gave him train fare to get home. But this made an enormous impression upon him. And he vowed at that time that he would do something to help people who were hungry, that nobody should suffer the way he had suffered on that day. And he stuck to his word. He gave turkeys anonymously to every employee at Macy's for every year, and no one ever knew where they came from. He bought coal when there were coal strikes. He bought coal for people who... At Macy's, they were the first store. They had a nurse. They had a doctor on staff. They were the first store to have a mutual aid society. They had a lunchroom where every employee could get free coffee and some kind of a roll or Danish. And they could have very, very low-cost meals at the store because Isidore and Nathan found out that the people were not buying lunch because they were saving money for an old relative who was sick or something. They were saving their money. And so they provided that they would have meals there. They were an amazing, amazing family. In the 1890s, 2 of Nathan's very young children died. He had a farm at the time. And he reasoned that if the cows had tuberculosis, maybe tuberculosis was getting into the milk. And maybe that was what was happening. There were no regulations for sanitary conditions at all for milk cows, dairy cows. And so he had met Louis Pasteur in his travels. Pasteur had occurred to him that he could use this process for milk. But Nathan made them. And so he built a laboratory in New York City to pasteurize milk. And then he built depots all over New York City. This is the first milk depot. And he would give out free or very, very low-cost milk so that people who couldn't afford to buy milk or couldn't afford to get clean milk would have it. He's credited with saving the lives of millions of babies. One of the things he instituted, every once in a while on eBay, you find milk bottles from Nathan Straus. What he did was he made milk bottles with rounded bottoms so that they couldn't be put down because the homes were dirty. And so once you bought this milk, you had to give it to your child right away. And that was a way to ensure that it stayed clean. I mean, he was providing it. Then he went around the world. After he succeeded in convincing the people in the United States that this was a good idea, he went around the world and instituted pasteurization. He said to municipalities, I will build, with my own money, a milk laboratory if you will send people, professionals, to learn how to pasteurize milk. Pretty remarkable. He was, as you know, interested in tuberculosis. And so he created in Lakewood, New Jersey, in the early 1900s, the German Jews went to New Jersey in the summer. And some of them went to the Lakewood Hotel where he was denied admission because he was a Jew. And so he and some of his fellow businessmen bought the hotel. I'll show them. And then he turned it into what he called a preventorium. The idea was that if healthy children were living in a family house where there was tuberculosis, that they were likely to catch tuberculosis. If you take them out of that home for the summer and give them wholesome, healthy food, fresh air, exercise, that they will build up their immunity. I mean, it's pretty remarkable that he would think of a thing like that in 1910. And so he had a preventorium first in Lakewood, New Jersey, and then a good friend of his was Hearst and Arthur Brisbane of Hearst Publications. And Arthur Brisbane donated some land in New Jersey, a little bit further inland, and they built more preventoriums, and they saved a lot of kids that way. On the right, you see the Nathan Straus Health Center in Jerusalem. On one of his travels, he went to Palestine and became so excited, he became a staunch Zionist, and built this health center. It's still there today. It's called the Nathan and Lena Straus Health Center. And he also built lots in all over Israel. He built lots and lots of places where people could learn a skill, where they could learn how to work. So somebody said to me, "Oh, did you know the city of Netanya is named for Nathan Straus?" And indeed it is. It was named for him in the hope that he would give them some money. It's a little backwards, but what happened is by then he said, I've given away 3/4 of my fortune. I really don't have anything left to give you. And so they sent him, the mayor, to his home in Mamaroneck, New Jersey, in the hopes that he could chat with the guy and talk him into giving a little bit more money. And the mayor was really, really excited because he thought, wow, I'm going to this very rich man's home. I'm going to be wined and dined and it'll be wonderful. But by then, Nathan and Lena were quite old and not wining and dining anymore. And the mayor was really disgruntled because he was served cold cornflakes for breakfast. And he came away with no money. Nathan wrote, "Give until it feels good." He said, "What you give in health is gold. What you give in sickness is silver. What you give in death is lead." And by the time he died in 1931, he'd given away 3/4 of his fortune. He's revered around the world for his selfless philanthropy. And I've just put up one memorial to him. Unfortunately, because of the Depression and the war, this one was never built. But I think it's a lovely memorial, and so I thought I would show it to you. It says, "Pasteur, great master of medicine, Straus, savior of babies." I think it's lovely, and it's apparently quite large. It was done, sculpted by the C.S. Pietro family. A book is being written now about that family, and so this memorial will be included in it, with information about that. I don't know where it is. I don't know. I have to talk to the author of this book to see if it still exists. This is a model. It's not the full scale. It's a small model. Okay, now we turn to Isidore. I think he's best known, as I said, for having died on Titanic. But as the family says, we are so much more than that. Isidore was really the head of R.H. Macy and L. Straus & Sons, and he and his brother Nathan, as you've already learned, built the store on 34th Street with the assistance of Isidore's sons, Jesse and Percy. His third son, Herbert, was still at Harvard, and Nathan's sons, Hugh Grant Straus and Charles Webster Straus, who later changed his name to Nathan Jr., were considerably younger and not yet entered into business when the building opened. Isidore was asked in 1894 to run for an unexpired seat of the House of Representatives, and he did win that election. He served as a close friend and advisor to Grover Cleveland, and he was considered an expert on tariff matters. Like his brother, he felt that it was his duty to serve when asked. But when his term expired, he requested that his name not be submitted for re-election, as his responsibilities at home were great. And I've included this slide simply because I like it so much. It was taken at the Folies Bergère, April 4th, 1907. And the original photograph had a note handwritten by Isidore that read, "We ate some birds for lunch. Mrs. Straus, my interpreter, translated them as swallows. In reality, they were larks. This is the consequence." And then he wrote, "Taken at night by electric light." Isidore never publicized or emphasized his philanthropic endeavors. He did what he thought was right, what must be done, what he was able to do without the need for notoriety or publicity. I've seen his personal daytimers. He had little tiny booklets that he carried in his vest pocket. And every single night after work, he had a meeting, he served on boards, he had something to do, always involved with helping his fellow man. He was a founder and the first president of the Educational Alliance, a settlement house tasked with teaching young immigrant families English and skills so they could find employment, as well as providing social services and a place for recreation. He also served on the board of the Clara de Hirsch Home for Working Girls, Montefiore Home for Chronic Invalids, which is now Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx, a huge institution, and several others. He was interested in Jewish causes, including the Hebrew Orphan Society. But not only Jewish causes. For many, many years he was part of the New York State Chamber of Commerce and on the board of Hanover Bank, for 27 years. And like his brother Oscar, his list of involvements is huge. We have pages and pages and pages. This is the last known photo we have of Isidore and Ida Nora. Their sons were minding the store. They would visit the spa towns in Germany and with families still left in Germany. Their last stop was in Paris for some shopping. And then they went to London, where they stayed at Claridge's Hotel. Ida wrote to her children in New York that she couldn't find matzah at the hotel, even though it was Passover, and she suspected that her grandchildren were having an Easter egg hunt on their lawn. And I included this photo because you saw a photo of their first home in Talbot. And this is Isidore's home on West 105th Street in Broadway. He owned the entire block. There were orchards, there were stables, and they had the first indoor bathtub, which they put on the second floor. And it was so heavy that they had to reinforce the floor. And so to get into the bathroom, one had to step up about 2 inches. And they all talked about it. They thought this was really very titillating. While Isidore and Ida were in Europe, their oldest son Jesse, his wife, and their daughter Beatrice decided it was their turn to go to Europe. And so the two families were crossing the ocean in opposite directions. Telegrams, which were called Marconis at that time, were a novelty. And so they were sending telegrams back and forth. And this is one that Isidore wrote that says, "Fine voyage, fine ship, feeling fine, what news?" And the date of this is April 14th. Ooh. Marconi's became really important once Titanic sank, because that's how news was getting back of the search, and we have many, many cables from family members and from various people, agencies that were looking for bodies. We also have descriptions, but I'm getting ahead of myself. After spending the winter abroad, Ida wanted to bring back a French maid, but she was unable to find anybody in Paris. And so in London, she hired a young woman who was going to escort them. And at the very last second, she decided she didn't want to come back. And so they hired Ellen Bird, who they didn't know anything about at all, but who was willing to travel with them. This is the last letter Ida wrote, and you can see it's written on Titanic stationery. When the ship left Southampton, it went to Cherbourg, and so it was mailed from Cherbourg. And so this is a real treasure. I'll read to you what it says. The letter was written to Mrs. Burbridge, the wife of the manager of Harrods department store. It reads, "Dear Mrs. Burbridge, you cannot imagine how pleased I was to find your exquisite basket of flowers in our sitting room on the steamer. The roses and carnations are all so beautiful in color and so fresh, as though they had just been cut. Thank you so much for your sweet attention, which we both appreciate very much. But what a ship! So huge and magnificently appointed. Our rooms are furnished in the best of taste and most luxuriously, as they really are rooms, not cabins. But size seems to bring us troubles. Mr. Straus, who was on deck when the start was made, said that at one time it looked painfully near to a repetition of the Olympian's experience on her first trip out of the harbor. But the danger was soon averted, and we are now well on our course across the channel to Cherbourg. Again, thanking you and Mr. Burbridge for your lovely attention and your wishes, and on the pleasant anticipation of seeing you with us next summer. I am, with cordial greeting, which Mr. Straus heartily joins, very sincerely yours, Ida R. Straus." What's very interesting about this letter is that Ida's name was actually Rosalie Ida Blum Straus. I have never seen her write her name Rosalie. We have hundreds and hundreds of letters. They're all signed Ida. And I have never seen her use that initial R at all. So this is a very odd but quite wonderful letter. We're thrilled to have it. The Olympia that she was referring to was a sister ship of Titanic, also very enormous, and it was launched in 1911. And when it was launched, it collided with a ship called the Hawk. No one anticipated the draw and the suction that would be created by these propellers because they were so enormous, or that it would take quite so long to turn the ship because of its size. And so she was saying that they nearly collided, and it's true, with another ship because of the size and the maneuverability. I know you all know the story of the sinking of Titanic, so I'm not going to tell you the entire story. We'd be here for a very long time. But as the ship was sinking, Ida was offered a seat in a lifeboat. Isidore was also offered a seat in a lifeboat because the lifeboats were going out half full. And they said, you're a distinguished older gentleman, you can still make a big contribution, please get in a lifeboat. And he said, no, there are still women and children aboard. I can't get in, let the women and children go. And when she saw that he was not leaving, she got out. She took off her fur coat and gave it to Ellen Bird, saying, I won't be needing this anymore. And so Ellen Bird got in the lifeboat and was saved. And as we all know, Isidore and Ida were last seen clutching arm in arm on the deck. They were not in bed like in the movie. They were last seen arm in arm on the deck as the ship was sinking. We know this because a grocery buyer from Macy's was aboard the Carpathia, the rescue ship. And as survivors were being loaded onto the ship, he was interviewing them, asking, when did you last see the Strausses? And he wrote a very, very lengthy letter explaining the entire situation. And he said, from what I can deduce, this was the last time that the Strausses were seen. An aside, Isidore came to this country in 1845. Ida in 1851. Neither of them had German accents. So when you see them portrayed in movies and in the Broadway play, and they have German accents, I am told it's called literary license or artistic license. But family members have confirmed that neither of them had a German accent. Okay, so Ellen Bird was saved with the fur coat. Once she got to New York, she went to the home of the Strausses' oldest daughter, Sarah, to give the coat back. And Sarah said, no, my mother gave it to you, you should have it. And then Ellen Bird went to work for Daisy Spedden, who was another Titanic survivor and lived in Tuxedo, New York. And so we know that she had the fur coat. We sure would like to know what happened to it since then. Isidore's body was recovered. There was a ship called the Mackay Bennett, which recovered bodies, and his was among those recovered. Ida's was never found. He was taken first to Halifax on that ship, and then on a special train to New York, and was buried in Brooklyn at the Strauss-Combs Mausoleum at Bethel Cemetery. In 1930, his body was moved to a Strauss Mausoleum in Woodlawn Cemetery. I was there yesterday. It's really a lovely place. There are 3 buildings, 1, 2, 3, one for each of the sons. This is Percy's building, Jesse's building, Herbert's building. And then there is this replica of the Egyptian galley ship. And Isidore's body is in the ground right there. Isidore and Ida, by the way, shared the same birthday, February 6th, and died on the same day. And there's a lovely inscription on the inside of the wall. And it's a really beautiful and lovely place to visit. Almost immediately after the Titanic sinking, a committee was formed with the idea of dedicating a memorial to Isidore and Ida Straus. A small triangular piece of land was selected on West 106th Street between Broadway and West End Avenue. That's right, a block from where they lived. It didn't take long for the memorial to be fully funded. On April 15, 1915, that's 3 years later, Straus Park was dedicated by Mayor Mitchell and the people of New York. We have a picture of it. That was the dedication ceremony. There used to be a reflecting pool in front of this statue. The statue is called Memory, and it's a lovely allegorical statue. It appears down on what used to be a reflecting pool, where one could, quote, peacefully contemplate over a sheet of water, leaving it to the meditative public to muse over the sacrifice, the same element demanded in the Titanic disaster. In the 1990s, I think about 1995, we convinced the city that they needed to do a little work to refurbish this. And there is today a wonderful group called Friends of Straus Park that maintains the landscaping, that makes sure that everything is lovely. And they have events there, and they're really quite nice. There's a website, and they're on Facebook, but you can see the reflecting pool was filled in when we refurbished the park because there were a lot of homeless people that were bathing in it and urinating in it. And we wanted the neighborhood people to enjoy it. And so we have a little landscape gardener who takes care of it and keeps the neighborhood kids come and plant tulips, and there's always something seasonal. And there's very nice concerts and street fairs and stuff that happen up there. And if you're ever in that neighborhood, I encourage you to visit. It's really a very peaceful, lovely place. Isidore began writing his autobiography in 1911 at the request of his oldest son, Jesse. But because of the Titanic, he was unable to finish that. In 1957, his oldest daughter, Sarah, privately published the unfinished biography just for the family. And in 2011, on its 100th anniversary, the Straus Historical Society decided it was time to republish this. Since it had not been finished, we decided that we would add articles to complement the stories, and we also added photographs. And so we brought with us on the table on the side, we have books for purchase, and I will sign them if you want, that complete the story and fill in the parts that we haven't had time to tell you about today. So as I've come to the end of this part of my talk, I hope you've learned something new about the Strauses. And I've spoken to you about only a very, very small part of the family. Succeeding generations have carried on the traditions of public service and philanthropy, but there really isn't enough time to tell you about all of them. I write a newsletter twice a year, and it's posted on our website. In 2007, a file of letters was accidentally discovered at EVO in New York City, the Institute for Jewish Research in New York City. And these letters were between Otto Frank and Nathan Straus Jr. and various refugee organizations. It turns out that in 1941, Otto Frank suddenly realized how desperate his family's situation was and decided he had to get out. And he wrote to his friend, Nathan Straus Jr., who at the time was housing administrator under FDR, and said, help. And Nathan Jr. said, okay. And so for a period from April through December, when we became involved in the war and the war closed all communication, we have about 85 letters between these two men and various rescue organizations trying to work out how Otto Frank and his family can come to this country. As we all know, that didn't work out, and it's a really incredible story. In 2007, when these letters were discovered, I was lucky enough to be given a packet of them because I had been corresponding with Buddy Elias, who was the nephew of Otto Frank, and I had been working with various authors who had written books because we all knew of the connection between these two men. And so I was given a packet of these letters, and I wrote an article for this newsletter that I've mentioned, and I sent a copy of it to Buddy Elias, who said, I'm really very impressed with what you've done telling this story. I'd like to give you a grant to do anything you'd like relating to the letters. And I said, oh great, I'll write a book. Then I said, what, am I crazy? But I've made the commitment. And so I've written a book about the two men, their lives, and about the letters and what happened between them. And this is a story that has never been told before and is only in the book. And so I brought copies of that book as well. If anybody's interested, we'd be happy to share that with you as well. And so as I come to the end of my talk, I hope you've learned a little bit about the Strauses, a little bit about German Jewish immigration, about the Civil War, about Macy's, about everything. I'd be happy to answer some questions, and we'll hang around and talk a little. But thank you very much. Nobody fell asleep, I think. To what extent?
Would they have a kosher home? I noticed you have Nathan Straus Jr., Nathan before. Do they go to temple?
Okay, the question is, to what extent did the Strausses practice Judaism? And it's kind of an interesting question. When Lazarus came here, they were observant. When Lazarus and the family came here, they were observant Jews. There was no such thing as conservative, reformed, Orthodox. They were observant. He stated at one point that God wanted him to survive, and since the only protein they could get at the time came from a pig, he felt it was okay for them to eat pork. They were practical people. Once they moved to New York, they were busy earning a living. They were very driven people. They belonged, a lot of them, Lazarus was one of the founders of Temple Bethel in New York City, and very active. In 1923, that temple merged with Temple Emmanuel. And many of the family members are still involved with that. However, particularly Isidore's family, many of Isidore's, he had 6 children, many of them married out. The children were raised by governesses and they were taken to church on Sunday morning. Some of them do not identify as Jews. I've done a lot of oral histories, and I tried to talk to the older members of the family first. And many years ago, I spoke to one guy, and I said, everybody in the family always asks about each other, are they Jewish? So I said, so tell me, are you Jewish? And he said, I'm Episcopalian. But of course everybody knows we're Jewish. And that was just fine with him. Nathan's family has remained Jewish just about entirely. Some of them go to synagogue, but all of them identify as Jew. Oscar's family, about half of them identify as Jews, and the ones that do are Reformed Jews. Hermina's family identify as nothing. About half of Isidore's family identify as Jews, but I don't know that any of them go to synagogue. Certainly, the story about once when they were in Georgia is that there were no synagogues, there were no rabbis, there was no way that they could observe. But Lazarus, being a respected member of the community and being an intellectual, became very friendly with the Methodist and Episcopalian ministers. And they would teach the boys from the Old Testament, but omit the New Testament. And so the children did get a Jewish education while they were in Georgia. And that's the best I can do. Yes?
Could you please tell us about the problems that the Straus family has had in retrieving their papers from the Macy's organization?
Okay, he's asking about the problem that the Straus family members had. That's how I got involved. There was a very, very, very bitter leveraged buyout in 1986. The family had owned this building since 1902, and before then it had been downtown. And people had just been sending all the personal papers to store there because it was a great big building. In the early 1980s, I decided my brain was going to atrophy if I didn't do something, and so I invented a job where I suggested I would do research for people. And at the time, there was no internet, there was no home computer stuff, and so I put an ad in the New York Times in the book review saying I would do research, and people would call me up and say, can you tell me about such and such? And I would say, sure, and I'd read a bunch of books and write a report, and it was great. In 1990, a man named Bob Straus, Isidore and Ida's grandson, who lived in Santa Barbara, called me and said, my family owned Macy's for 100 years on a very bitter leveraged buyout. On a handshake, we had been promised all our personal things. But it was so bitter that they've reneged on all of that. And so he had already hired 4 other people to try and get the papers out, and they'd been unsuccessful, and he said to me, you think you can do it? And I said, I haven't a clue. But if you give me the name of somebody loyal to Macy's, to the family, I'll talk to them, and I'll see what I can do. And it was the right day, the person was happy, I said the right combination of things, and so she gave me access to them, and so we arranged to have all these personal papers released to the library, to rare books and manuscript. But I had copies of everything, but nobody knew what that everything was. And so that's how I started in this job. First organizing everything, and then having translations, because we had French, we had letters from Napoleon, we had old German papers, we had the letters Isidore wrote from Europe to his mother back in the United States during the Civil War. So we organized all this stuff, and then in 1993, Bob Straus came to New York. He knew about 6 cousins, and so we met at the apartment of one of the cousins, and he described what I had been doing, and we decided then that maybe we should try and find the living Straus family members. And so I borrowed all of their address books, and I wrote letters to everybody and said, who's your mother, who's your father, who's your sister, who's your brother? And from that we started an address book, and then I started writing the newsletter because Bob thought maybe it's a good idea to tell all these people what we're doing. And in 1998 we became a not-for-profit, Straus Historical Society, and here I am. And that's the story. Yes? No, they belong to the New York Public Library, unfortunately. Since that time, I have visited family members, and they have given us their originals. So we have quite a large archive. But the papers that started this whole thing are in the public library. You can get access to them. If you'd like to see them, they're there, and they're in the Rare Books Manuscript Division. You have to make an appointment, but they will bring you 1 box of papers at a time. Yes? Oh, well, he wants to know, it's my husband, he's very cute. He wants to know some of the other prominent families. Some of you are aware of the book Our Crowd. There's a lot of mistakes in Our Crowd. However, the family's all intermarried, and so Roger William Straus married Gladys Guggenheim, which some of you may not know was one of the founders of Gourmet magazine. And Nathan Sissy married Irving Lehman, who was Chief Justice of the Appellate Court, the highest court in New York, and his brother was Herbert Lehman, who was governor of New York. And the list goes on and on. Who else? We have everybody. I don't know. Cat, help me. Who else? Oh, Roger William Straus III is a photographer. Roger William Straus Jr. was the founder of Farrar, Straus and Giroux. There's just a really very interesting autobiography of him very recently. But it's an amazing family of achievement, of accomplishment, philanthropy, of public service, and remains that today. I mean, to me, it's a privilege to work with this family. It's just wonderful. Anne was giving me a sign that said, "There's coffee and bagels across the hall." Kat and I will be around to sell you books if you're interested, and we'll stay here and answer personal questions. And I thank you all.